An elderly woman walked into the supermarket. Her silver hair spilled beneath a worn, army green knit cap, a gleaming silver medal pinned to her chest. She only wanted to buy a few cans of food. But as she stepped up to the checkout line, a sharp, mocking laugh pierced the air. "You think you're some kind of hero?" sneered a young man. "That medal looks like one of those fake ones you buy online." His cold stare cut through her like a blade. The store fell silent. Not a word, not a soul stepped in to defend her. They all just stood there, letting a veteran, a woman who once risked her life to save her comrades, be humiliated like some cheap fraud. But just minutes later, a stranger appeared. And with him came a truth buried for nearly 60 years. Why is it that someone who once carried the weight of others' lives on her shoulders could be dismissed so easily, all because of an old coat and a few gray hairs? And who among us will have the courage, in a world that looks away, to say, "She is a hero"? Stay with us until the end of this story, and don't forget to subscribe to Veteran Best Stories for more heart-shaking truths that society often chooses to forget. Her name is Loretta Jameson, a name once etched onto the honor roll, a name once spoken amid applause at the White House in 1966. A former U.S. Navy servicewoman who risked her life in the jungles of Vietnam, not for glory, but for humanity. She didn't carry a weapon into combat. She carried her hands and her heart. Amid shellfire, smoke, and the moans of the severely wounded, she didn't just save fellow soldiers. She saved the conscience of those who watched her work. The silver medal she wore today wasn't for show. It was part of her flesh and blood, a fragment of the years she could never forget and didn't dare to. Now, at 79 years old, she was just a small, slender figure with snow-white hair, walking slowly like a shadow down the crowded aisles of a Fairfax grocery store. No one recognized her. No one looked up from their phones to see the face lined with age, but glowing with survival. No one realized that the trembling hands pushing the shopping cart were once the same hands that held closed the artery of a dying soldier in the field. Mrs. Loretta didn't come looking for recognition. She only wanted to buy a few cans of beans and a loaf of bread, just enough to get through the cold days ahead. But the moment she reached the checkout counter, everything seemed to stop. The eyes of the young cashier, Kyle, barely 25, scanned her silver hair, then dropped to the medal on her chest. Before she could speak, he gave a crooked smile and shook his head. "Sorry, we don't serve people pretending to be veterans," he said. "That medal looks like a cheap fake from the internet." His tone was casual, like he was rejecting an expired coupon. His face didn't show doubt. It showed chilling certainty. The air around the checkout counter seemed to thin. The customers behind her froze. A middle-aged woman quietly switched to another line. An elderly man bowed his head and stared at his phone. No one stepped in. No one said a word. Loretta stood still, her sunken eyes locked on the young man's face. There was no anger, no protest, only a deep, quiet stillness, the kind that only those who have survived war truly understand. It wasn't Kyle's words that brought shame. It was the silence. The memory of those who didn't make it, of the blood-filled eyes she once covered with her hands, of the young nurses who collapsed beside their patients before finishing their duties. She didn't need applause. She didn't need a post on social media praising her. All she ever wanted was for silence to be replaced by kindness. But today, in the very land she served, she was treated like a joke, her lips pressed together, gently, no words spoken. But inside her chest, her heart pounded louder than usual. It wasn't humiliation that made it ache. It was memory. The memory of those dying soldiers she once held, their eyes begging to go home. She had promised them she would live for them, speak for them. And now, here she was again, a ghost, wandering through a world that had forgotten. She gently set her basket down, slowly turning away. But her legs gave out. One step, then a halt. A brief moment that felt like a century. No one reached to steady her. She braced herself against the counter to keep from falling, steadied her breath, and pushed forward. Each step heavier than the last, as if she carried the souls of the fallen on her back. The cold outside was nothing compared to the chill in human eyes. In the war zones, she had once feared the sound of bombs, once trembled at the thought of dying, but she had never feared apathy, not until now. Behind her, the beeping of scanned items continued. Life went on. But for Loretta, time froze. Because in that moment, she understood something deeply painful. Not everyone remembers. Not everyone knows that the freedom they enjoy each day was bought by souls like hers, who once stood between death and life, with nothing but their own. Mrs. Loretta turned to walk away, but her aged body could no longer bear the invisible blow delivered by those humiliating words. Her legs wobbled. In an instant, that small frame tilted to one side, almost collapsing onto the cold tile floor. Fortunately, a passing shopper caught her in time. Saying nothing, he gently guided her to a bench against the wall. There she could sit and reclaim breaths that had grown ragged. Her hands trembled, not from the temperature, but from something colder than the winter wind. Indifference. No one spoke up to defend her. No one offered a single word of concern. The young cashier behind the counter kept working. His practiced hands scanned items as if nothing had happened. On that youthful face there was no trace of remorse, only apathy. A sentiment deeply ingrained in generations no longer taught gratitude. Mrs. Loretta did not look up. She placed both hands on her lap, leaning forward slightly. Each breath was an effort, and each beat of her chest was a reminder of the souls she had saved, and the ones she had lost. Those soldiers died believing the world would be better tomorrow, but now she was not so sure. Just then, the supermarket's glass doors swung open. A cold gust swept in, carrying snow dust, and the arrival of a tall man with a hardened face, his eyes as sharp as steel, forged from discipline and duty. He entered as though the space had just been seized by a different force. His name was Marcus Levine, Lieutenant Commander, recently off the aircraft carrier after a long deployment with the Pacific Fleet. He'd stopped by the supermarket to pick up a few quick groceries for his mother, an ordinary errand, with no notion he was about to witness a buried fragment of history in the middle of a winter afternoon. Yet when Marcus glanced toward the bench near the entrance, his gaze stopped. At first, there was confusion. Then, stunned disbelief. The silver-haired woman sitting with her head bowed. Something about her was achingly familiar. That posture, that bearing. And then, an image flashed in his mind, not of the grown man he was today, but of a 6-year-old boy, curled up in a female medic's arms as alarms blared non-stop. He remembered her face clearly, face streaked with smoke and dirt, eyes filled with tension yet shining with an uncanny resolve. A gentle but decisive voice that once told him, "It will be all right. You will go home." He recalled his small, trembling hands clutching at her uniform as the helicopter lifted off from the field hospital, leaving behind gunfire, blood, and mud. That was the last time he saw her, the woman who changed the course of his life. Marcus closed the distance, each step slowing as he navigated the crowd. He could not take his eyes off Mrs. Loretta. Even after more than 30 years, not a single feature on her face had escaped him, not because of her appearance, but because of her presence. Someone who once stood amid hell and still carried a calm gaze, as if death had been just another detail in her mission. In that moment, the world seemed to freeze for him. Amid the supermarket's cacophony of scanners and rolling carts, he heard his own heart, pounding, rapid, partly from emotion, partly from anger. Anger for her, the woman who once risked her life to save others, now sitting alone in a corner like a stranger discarded. Then he looked around and saw the young cashier smiling at another customer, completely unaware that he had just insulted a living legend. Marcus's anger did not erupt in a shout. It settled into his eyes, into the determined stride that carried him straight to the checkout counter, where the story was about to take a very different turn. Marcus did not walk. He advanced as if bearing the weight of an entire generation. Each decisive step echoed through the supermarket's usually noisy expanse, as though sound itself had been drained away. His gaze never wavered from the checkout counter, where a young man fumbled with mundane items, unaware he had just trespassed on something sacred. When Marcus reached the counter, he halted, shoulders squared, breathing steady like a drill sergeant's cadence. His voice was not loud, but deep and resonant enough to freeze everyone in place. Who refused service to Mrs. Loretta Jameson? The air grew so heavy one could feel it shift. The cashier, Kyle, looked up, eyes flashing confusion. Before him now stood no ordinary customer, but an officer in crisp uniform. An honor badge rested over his heart, not beating merely for survival, but for dignity. Kyle stammered a half-hearted excuse, failing to convince anyone, least of all himself. We just doubted her paperwork. Without yelling or condemning, Marcus responded with action. He placed an ID card on the counter. Its surface gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Levine Marcus, Lieutenant Commander, United States Navy. Then he withdrew from his wallet something he always carried as a piece of memory, an old photograph, blurred by time yet still clear as though taken yesterday. In the photo was a mud-smeared boy, fear in his eyes, cradled by a woman's arms. Her face was streaked with blood, hair tangled by smoke. Yet on her lips was a gentle smile, a single light amid hellfire. Her hands held that child, not only with strength, but with a whispered promise. You will live. Marcus turned the photo toward Kyle. Do you recognize this woman? Now his eyes were not those of an officer, but of a son, one who had been saved, and was now speaking for the forgotten. That is Mrs. Loretta Jameson, the woman you just despised. Once stood in the blast zone at Pleiku, defying artillery fire to shield medics and wounded soldiers. She saved nearly 50 people that hellish night, including me. Marcus's voice did not tremble, yet it brimmed with emotion on the verge of overflow. The medal she wears is not decoration. It symbolizes a soul that endured, that fought, and sacrificed a part of her life so our generation could live safely today. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink into every witness. The nearby staff said nothing. Customers around the checkout froze. Eyes shifted away from phones and shopping lists, now fixed on a confrontation more significant than groceries or receipts. Marcus bowed his head, retrieving the photograph as if gathering scattered truth from apathy and neglect. He looked up again, this time his tone softer yet no less resolute. "And you, what have you done with that legacy today? You saw a frail old woman, not the soldier still alive within her. You judged by sight, rather than by the memory of history and respect." No one spoke. The entire supermarket felt drawn into a strange moment, where the truth was so glaring that any excuse seemed absurd. Kyle stood motionless. His lips quivered. No words could escape. His eyes, once cold, now shone with confusion and shame. No justification could salvage that moment. Only silence remained, and in that silence, shame began to take root. Marcus turned back to Mrs. Loretta. She sat unmoving, hands clasped on her lap, showing neither anger nor sorrow. Only the calm of someone who had outlived many who remembered her, and understood that truth, even when late, is the deepest healing. The supermarket manager appeared, his face panicked as if he had just learned that a 4-star general had entered the checkout area. In a light gray suit, with his name badge dangling from his chest, he rushed toward Marcus. His hand tapped Marcus's shoulder, a hasty gesture of appeasement. Before Marcus could speak, the manager bowed his head in apology. Words poured out of him like a pressure valve suddenly released. But in Marcus's eyes, calm remained intact. No anger, no agitation, only a cold silence, waiting for the other to confront his own mistake. The apology fell like dust, too light to reach the core of the insult Mrs. Loretta had just endured. For words, even if framed in gold, could not atone for the cost of the silence she had suffered in that supermarket corner before indifferent gazes. Marcus did not need soothing words. He needed action, public, official, and accountable. And he demanded that, not for himself, but for a soldier who once stood between life and death, now disrespected simply because time had dimmed the eyes that once shone amidst the bombs. The manager nodded. And so, in less than 24 hours, a ceremony was held in the small plaza in front of the supermarket. Fresh flowers adorned the stage, a plaque of honors displayed, and a microphone blared through speakers that echoed down the street. Local residents attended, not out of curiosity, but believing they were doing something necessary. Reporters were present, cameras and notepads in hand, knowing that sometimes a truthful story held more power than 100 staged reports. On the makeshift wooden stage, Mrs. Loretta stood beside Marcus, flanked by officers in crisp uniforms. Sunlight gleamed off the metal on her chest. For the first time in many years, that light was more than metal. It was the glow of recognition restored. The old coat she wore, faded, threadbare, could not hide her dignified posture. Though her legs were weak, she stood tall, as if every spine in her body were a token forged from discipline and loyalty. A gentle breeze blew, and in the morning's chill, petals fell around her feet like a belated gratitude from the past. When the host called her name and recounted her deeds at the Pleiku Field Hospital, something shifted in the crowd. Eyes glistened, and applause rang out, modest but sincere, enough to show she was no longer forgotten. Marcus stood beside her, his hand squeezing hers, with a silent message someone needed to hear. You have been seen, you have been heard, you have been honored. But for Loretta, that moment was not about her being remembered. It was to ensure those she once served, those who stood with her, and those who never returned from halfway around the world would be remembered in the way they deserved. When it was her turn to speak, she did not say much. She shared one memory, not of her own exploits, but of a young nurse named Charlene, who shielded a severely wounded soldier while Mrs. Loretta was busy saving another doctor. Charlene did not survive. Loretta had never forgotten those eyes that knew one might not return, yet still chose to step forward. Her voice did not tremble, It did not thunder like an orator's, but wove into every listener's heart like a whisper everyone could understand. And in the moment, she said, "I stand here today not to be remembered, but to remind you that there are those who will never have the chance to be remembered." The crowd fell silent. A measure of justice had been restored, not by flowers, plaques, or applause, but by the community's gaze, eyes full of understanding, because justice, sometimes, is not a judgment of right or wrong, but an acknowledgement of the value of what has been forgotten for far too long. For Mrs. Loretta, it was no longer just an award ceremony. It was a doorway allowing the past to enter the present, letting the voices of the silent echo amid the hustle of life. And in that moment, she no longer stood alone. News of Mrs. Loretta spread not through sensational headlines, but through the profound silence of a generation forgotten. Within hours of a short clip capturing the supermarket tribute, millions of views surged in like a wave of genuine emotion. These were no longer superficial comments. Rather, they were words of gratitude written from the memories of those who once donned the uniform, those who knew that the price of freedom is not a number, but blood, tears, and memories never washed away. Mrs. Loretta unexpectedly became a living symbol, not because of fame, but because she embodied what had been forgotten: loyalty, sacrifice, and quiet dignity. Every notification arriving in her old inbox was a thank you note from veterans who once endured in silence, afraid to speak up lest people forget who they had been. Letters arrived from Florida, Arizona, even from overseas military bases, all carrying the same sentiment: gratitude and awakening. A group of former service members decided to do something tangible rather than merely express emotion. They established the Veterans Honor Food Fund, a program designed to provide regular food assistance to veterans living in need. Remarkably, the very supermarket where the incident occurred, once at the center of her pain, became the first sponsor. This gesture was not only an atonement, but also a way for the community to reclaim the memory they had once carelessly discarded. Mrs. Loretta did not speak much about these developments. She never claimed to be a symbol. She simply smiled when she saw positive outcomes sprouting from what seemed like a small event. To her, titles were transient, but action, if planted at the right moment, could yield profound change. Soon, invitations began to arrive from local schools, military academies, even high school classrooms where history is often reduced to dry dates. They invited her not to recount war stories in a heroic fashion, but to share real experiences, what remained after the gunfire: fear, loneliness, camaraderie, and human kindness amid chaos. At first, she hesitated. It had been a long time since she stood before a crowd. But after a sleepless night and reading a handwritten letter from a 10th grader saying, "I never understood why we should thank veterans until I saw your story," she decided to accept. In those talks, Mrs. Loretta did not use slides or visual aids. She brought only her old coat, a worn baseball cap, and a gentle yet firm voice. She spoke from the heart, and listeners, from students to teachers, fell silent, as if hearing history not from textbooks, but from a living, breathing human being. One unexpected moment. Kyle, the cashier from that day, appeared at her first talk, uninvited, yet not prevented. He stood at the back of the auditorium, quietly absorbing every word. When the session ended, he approached Mrs. Loretta, not to apologize, but to ask to accompany her. From that day on, Kyle became her companion for most visits. He said little, merely handling sound setup, arranging seats, sometimes making her tea before class. Yet the change was not in what he did, but in his gaze. No longer hurried, but learning to pause and listen. He began reading books about the Vietnam War. He took notes. He sought out local veterans to ask their stories, not to atone, but for something deeper, personal growth. The apology he owed Mrs. Loretta was never spoken in public, but it lived in the way he bowed his head before each veteran, in the respectful silence when she spoke, and in his grateful eyes whenever he watched her take the podium. For Mrs. Loretta, this was the most beautiful journey, not to be recognized, but to witness a young heart learning respect, and from there, carrying forward the values she had preserved all her life. Virginia on a Saturday morning always carried a leisurely pace. The sunlight was gentle, and a soft breeze rustled through the ancient oak canopy, casting dappled shade onto the brick path that led into the small park on the southern edge of town. There were no large signs, no loudspeakers, no raised stage or floodlights. There was simply a cool patch of grass, a few folding chairs neatly arranged, a steaming pot of hot tea, and a silver-haired woman quietly seated in the middle of that small circle. Mrs. Loretta maintained the habit of coming here every weekend, not out of duty, nor because she was invited, but for something deeper. A silent promise to those who had passed, that when they could no longer tell their own stories, she would tell them instead. These gatherings had no set schedule. They offered no special guarantees. Yet people still came, silently, steadily, and with a rare reverence in a world that was already too noisy. Kyle always arrived before everyone else. The young man who had once embodied indifference now carefully aligned each chair as if each one were reserved for an important witness of time. He brewed the tea by hand, avoiding the automatic dispenser, because Mrs. Loretta liked water that was truly boiled, truly warm. He needed no reminders, no instructions. Those things had become part of his very breath. Mrs. Loretta did not tell her stories in chronological order. She did not speak of victories, but of what remained after victory had passed. The tattered shoes she had worn for 3 days in the forest without rations. The final embrace with a comrade when she knew she could not get him out of the line of fire. Or the gaze of a young soldier who had left behind an unsigned letter to his mother. Her voice was soft, warm. Each word soaked into the air, spread through every gust of wind, and then anchored itself somewhere deep in each listener's heart. The young people who came did not come for a history lesson. They came for something real, a feeling of connection to a part of their country they only knew through books. A realization that freedom was not given, but paid for at a very high cost. Mrs. Loretta never rose when she spoke. She remained seated, her eyes distant as if searching for old faces, voices silenced by gunfire. Sometimes she halted mid-sentence, not because she forgot the words, but because the emotions were too full to be forced into a sentence. And in those moments, no one interrupted. They let her be, understanding that it was not silence, but part of the story. Kyle always sat slightly behind, not facing her directly, but close enough that if she needed anything, he would be there immediately. He never looked at his phone while she was speaking. He did not take notes. He simply listened, with both ears, and with a heart learning to feel the unseen. Mrs. Loretta did not need anyone's acclaim. She disliked being called a hero. For her, happiness came from small details. The teary eyes of a young girl after the storytelling. The slow nod of an elderly veteran as he revisited a memory he thought had vanished. Or simply the knowledge that a young person was taking a seat for something greater than themselves. And for Kyle, the greatest lesson did not come from what she said, but from how she lived, the way she persisted, without anger, without show, but also without retreat. He learned that respect did not lie in titles, medals, or age, but in the ability to see the invisible, courage that needs no audience, memory that needs no speech, and gratitude that needs no ceremony. There were rainy mornings when few people came and many chairs remained empty, but Mrs. Loretta still came, and Kyle still brewed the tea, for they did not do this to be noticed. They did it for someone, somewhere, who still needed the reminder that sacrifices had been made and should not be forgotten. That park, every Saturday morning, was no longer just a place of leisure. It had become a silent sanctuary, where small stories rekindled a great flame in the hearts of Americans. A flame not blazing, but warm enough to make people slow down, bow their heads, and remember that they were living upon a foundation built on blood, tears, and unspoken resilience. In a society that never stops moving, we sometimes forget the souls who built its foundation. Mrs. Loretta's story reminds us that gratitude should not be a mere occasion, but a way of life. Share this video if you believe every hero deserves to be honored, not only in war, but also in everyday life. Subscribe to Veteran Best Stories so you won't miss moving, authentic, and inspiring stories about veterans, silent heroes in our daily lives.